Welcome to our program today. Thank you for joining us. We're here at Means Court, the school board's TV station, to tell you a little bit about what the University of Florida IFAS is doing here for St. Lucie County. We have a lot of people working both in extension, teaching, and research. And that might be something that people don't realize. We have so many people here. We have people that are doing programs in extension for 4-H, master gardeners, master naturalists, citrus, commercial horticulture. We have a lot of people working in those areas. And then we also have people doing teaching programs where you can actually come to the University of Florida IFAS Indian River Research and Education Center out off the Kings Highway by the Turnpike, and you can actually earn degrees there. But one of my colleagues is somebody who works in research, Dr. Carey Minteer, who is one of my new colleagues at the University of Florida. And Dr. Minteer, and you mind if I call you Carey?
That's fine.
Yeah. Carey, thank you for joining us today. And as always, we appreciate having the ability to work with research and extension together because we have a big job to do, and it's always easier when we can work together. So what I'd like to do is just ask you a few questions to let people know a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do for the University of Florida and all the vitally important work that you do for the University of Florida. So tell me a little bit about your academic background and the position that you have for at UF-IFAS Indian River Research.
Ken, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and to talk to everybody. So my academic background, I started at the University of Central Arkansas, where I got my undergraduate degree in biology. And then for my master's degree, I moved to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, where I pursued a degree in biology again, a master's degree in biology, but with emphasis on studies in invasion biology with concentrating on invasive plants. I got my PhD in entomology from the University of Arkansas, where I concentrated on biological control of invasive weeds.
Okay, so we'll explore that a little bit. Since we are on the school board's TV station, I think it's always good for maybe some of the students that might be watching. How did you explore your academic interests? And I think sometimes when I talk to students, especially when they're in high school, it seems a little bit intimidating, the process of going for even an AA degree and then the bachelor's and then master's and PhD. What is it that moved you to do that? What motivated you to go as far as to get your PhD?
Well, I kind of took the long way around, I think. Like, I wasn't one of those students that necessarily knew exactly what I wanted to do when I went off to college. I knew I loved science and I loved biology, but I actually went into college as a pre-med student, as most people often do when they go into the sciences, and then realized quickly that that is not what I wanted to do. I'd love to be outside. I love to look at plants and animals and insects and things, and so I got my undergraduate degree and still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, and a couple years after I graduated decided, well, I really want to do the science thing, but I couldn't find a job with my undergraduate, and so I decided to go to grad school and remembered that I really enjoyed my plant classes during my undergraduate degree, and so decided to go and study plants and study invasive plants especially. And at the end of my master's, I knew I liked invasive plants, but I took a class in biological control, and that's what hooked me. And so here I was, had been in school for quite some time, and it finally clicked exactly what I wanted to do. Biological control is such a cool field, and just that one class, it was clear, and so I knew exactly what I had to do from that point.
Yeah. I think when I talk to a lot of people who have quite a bit of academic background, the thing that like the common denominator across the board is they've always followed their interests, and I think that leads to success. It leads to fulfillment and enjoyment in life. So, for the students that are out there listening, follow your interest. And it could be anything, whether it's the invasion biology, like what yours is. I love teaching personally, and I have a undergraduate degree in biology and a master's degree in agriculture. And I've always kind of followed my interest, but it doesn't necessarily have to be hard science. It can be, if you're the best cook in the world, why not follow that interest? So, I think that's kind of the key that I'd like the students watching to take with them today.
Yes.
So The work that you do at the University of Florida in River Research and Education Center, could you tell us what type of work is conducted at the quarantine lab there? People hear quarantine, I think they get a little bit unnerved. So what is it that you do?
They do. Okay, so at the quarantine facility, we do biological control research for control of both insect and weed pest. So my position is primarily to run the biological control of weed program. So we have another scientist that takes care of biological control of insects. But basically what we do are we bring insects in this case, or arthropod natural enemies, in that we think might be useful to control invasive weeds, and we bring them into quarantine, which means once they go into quarantine, they stay in quarantine while we do tests on these plants to make sure, or on these insects, to make sure that they're safe to be used as biological control. And so that's basically all the quarantine means, is that it's contained, that so that the insects that we bring in from foreign countries are safe in that facility while we do tests to make sure that they're safe to bring out.
So we're doing world-class research here, aren't we?
Yes.
You and the people that you work with at the quarantine site, as well as the rest of the University of Florida here in Fort Pierce, not only are we here in St. Lucie County, but we're around the world. And you know, you can go to places like Sydney, Australia, and mention a colleague's name and people will know them. So, you know, that's the talent that we have here locally. So, and of course the work that you're doing biologically, you know, the quarantine lab is important as well.
Of course, the biological control is an international business. Obviously, the insects and predators that we get to bring in to control our invasive problems are all over the world. And so it takes a lot of people, international collaborations, as well as national collaborations within the state.
So when you're doing that sort of foreign exploration, could you tell us a little bit about the goal, why foreign exploration is needed to match up the insect to the invasive plant that's here? Could you give us a little bit about that? Just consider a viewer that might not have heard the word biological control. And, you know, how would you explain that to them?
Okay, so invasive plants, as most of us in Florida are aware, are a big issue in the state. Invasive plants are from other areas, so they're exotic. They're not native to the U.S. And one of the reasons why we believe that these plants are such a problem is that they get brought in to a new area without their natural enemies, or without insects or other arthropods or other things that are feeding upon them. And what this does is so they're released, right, from this pressure of being fed upon like they are in their native range. Our native plants here have these insects and other arthropods and other things that are feeding on them and keeping them in check. So the invasive plants have a competitive advantage over our native plants, and they start to take over. What biological control is, and why foreign exploration is so important, is that when we go to these places where these invasive weeds are from, so Brazilian pepper is from Brazil, and so in order to find insects or other natural enemies to feed on this plant, we go to Brazil. We go to where the plant is from, because that is where the plant has the natural enemies that feed upon it. And when you go to do foreign exploration, these plants aren't typically widespread like they are in the invaded range.
So, for example, if you go to Brazil, Brazilian pepper is not a problem in Brazil like it is here.
Yeah, like it is here. Sometimes these plants can be weedy in their native ranges, but not always. And so sometimes they're difficult to find, which is why collaborations in those countries are so important. But when we go to find these insects or these other arthropods, we're looking for things that are only feeding on Brazilian pepper. So we don't want to see something that's feeding on Brazilian pepper and feeding on 3 other plant species that are close to the Brazilian pepper. So we want things that are specific, and that's the first step before we even bring them back into quarantine in the U.S.
So the goal then is to find insects that might be causing damage and biologically controlling the plant in its home territory, putting them through a risk assessment regime, bringing them into the U.S., and then performing more tests in the quarantine lab here in Fort Pierce and in other places, Fort Lauderdale, Gainesville, and other places in the state. So it's not simply a matter of finding an insect, eating the plants, bringing it in, and letting it go.
Right.
There's a lot more work. And I know years ago, when I first started with Extension at the beginning of 1990s, I've been around for a while, they were talking about Brazilian pepper biological control and how they were getting ready to release an insect to help with that. Well, that was 20-something years ago, and we still don't have any insects ready. So, yeah, it does take years, and we don't rush it either.
No. Safety is of paramount concern with biological control, and so sometimes these projects take quite some time. There is good news on the horizon with Brazilian pepper. So we have been working on insects for quite some time. Currently, we have 4 insect species in quarantine for Brazilian pepper, and 2 have recently been approved by the first step of the regulatory agency. So we have that first approval, and that's a pretty big step to overcome. We are now moving forward on the environmental assessments and other regulatory things that we have to get done to be able to release them into the wild, but it is moving forward, and we are cautiously optimistic that we might be releasing biological control agents for Brazilian pepper in 2017.
Well, for people that might not be familiar with the term invasive plant or invasive animal, we can have invasive plants and animals and insects. What is the difference between just a plain old weed and an invasive plant?
Okay. Well, there's one main thing that is the difference between weeds and invasive plants, maybe 2. So a weed, on one hand, can be native or exotic. And so it's basically a plant that's an issue. And scale. So a weed can be an issue in your front garden.
Okay.
It can be a weed in an agricultural field. An invasive plant, on the other hand, or an invasive period, is an exotic. It is not a native species. It is brought in from a different place. And invasives are problems on much larger scales, on landscape scales.
I think usually when I think of the word invasive, I think about how much effort and money goes into the management. So, it's a plant that comes from outside of Florida. Sometimes people bring it in on their own. Sometimes it makes it here accidentally. Propagates itself, spreads into other areas, and then it costs a lot of money and has ecological and economic damage associated with it. Whereas grass growing in the cracks of your sidewalk, that's obviously just a weed. But if you have the entire Everglades full of Melaleuca, well, that's quite a bit of a problem.
That's right.
Yeah. It's a matter of scale. So with biological control, I think one of the things that people ask me the most is, how safe is it? We've heard of, people are always talking about love bugs in Florida. And, people think University of Florida brought them into, I've heard it all about having love bugs eating mosquitoes or something. Well, obviously that's not true.
Right.
The University of Florida did not bring love bugs in. So the viewers, the University of Florida is not responsible for those. But there have been some notorious problems with biocontrol when it was early on, before we did research. And one would be that we used to call it the bufo toad, cane toads. The university and the government was not involved with this, but there were private enterprises, private entities that brought those cane toads in to eat beetles in the Everglades, and they just kind of took off and nothing was stopping them. And they have that toxin that they secrete that can be poisonous to dogs and things like that. So I think that is a classic example of biocontrol gone bad, but that was before we did all the research. So overall, do you think it's safe now with all the research that's done?
I think with all the research that is done, as well as the regulation that it has. So, like you said, in early, the beginnings of biological control, there wasn't as highly regulated, and we didn't do the kind of testing we do now. We have a really good understanding of how we test these things to be able to determine what the host range will be of these biological control agents, and we can tell you with 99.9% certainty when we release something that we will be able to tell you what exactly it will feed upon.
Great, great. Speaking of which, you have a terrarium here with some insects in it. And Lilioceras cheni. Am I saying that correctly? Lilioceras cheni?
There's different.
People say
Lilioceras.
Lilioceras. I never looked it up in the dictionary, and I don't think it would be in there anyhow.
Well, it's
but
Latin, so people, there's disagreements.
So, this is biological control for air potato. And I actually have some vine here. The viewers can't see this, but I have a bucket of stuff here. So this vine, I actually have this on extension property. And usually in the wintertime it starts to die back, but we still have some of this growing pretty healthy out there. So what is this insect that we're talking about here? What is this doing for air potato? Why is air potato a problem to begin with?
Okay, so air potato is an invasive plant from Asia, and we've had it in Florida for quite some time. Air potato is a vine. It can grow up trees. It can cover whole trees. It can cover entire areas, shading out things underneath it and killing our native plants. So scientists at the USDA, ARS, went and started looking for things to be able to eat this in China and Nepal. And what they found was the Lilioceras cheni, the air potato leaf beetle. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's this large red beetle. And
there might be one. There's some on the lid, so I'm going to pop the lid. They do fly, so hopefully the air conditioner is cold enough in here.
Well, the good thing about the air potato leaf beetle is that if they do get loose, it's okay. They're just going to go fly and find the closest air potato vine they can and start eating. So these guys are very good at controlling air potato. We've released them in the state through collaborations with UF, USDA, Florida Department of Agriculture, and many other agencies to be able to release these. And we have them established in the state. They find the plants rather readily and have started to both decrease vine length, vine coverage, and bulbul production. So
and the bulbils are those potatoes.
Oh, the air potatoes,
yeah,
yes.
And some people who are familiar with this vine see, they look like about the size of a softball. They look like a huge potato that just kind of grows on the leaf vines. And each of these leaf nodes can actually produce one of those. And I've seen them as small as the size of a pea, all the way up to the size of a softball. So if you don't get all of those, when you pull the vine out, if you try to control it mechanically or some other way with herbicides, one of those little pea-sized bulbils that are left could sprout another vine. Yep. So that's why we need these guys.
That's right.
Because they can do the work for us without the use of herbicides and all of that. So is this the answer to the problem with air potato?
It is a big piece. So with biological control will never eradicate a weed pest. So I like to say that the biological control agent or the natural enemy controls the weed, and then the weed controls the insect. So as the weed levels start to be reduced, the insect levels will also start to be reduced because there's less food, because we know that they will only feed on this plant. When the plants start to get released from that insect's pressure a little bit, they'll come back a little bit, and then the insects will come back a little bit.
They seem to find it again.
Yes, exactly.
So, in science, we always have to measure the success of any work that we do. So how would you measure success with biological control and with air potato leaf beetles?
Okay, well, so biological control, ultimately, the goal of it is to reduce the abundance of a weed on the landscape.
Okay.
And so that would be ultimate success. But there's varying levels of success that we can deal with. So in Melaleuca, we have reduced the amount of Melaleuca out in the landscape. There is more work to be done in Melaleuca. It is still fairly widespread, but much better than before. But the good thing about Melaleuca is that now we have drastically reduced the amount of time, the amount of manpower, and the amount of money we're spending on herbicides to be able to control it compared to what we were before we introduced biological control agents. So there's different varying levels of success, but reduction of the weed in abundance on the landscape is probably
So you could probably measure dollar amounts if you had an economist working with you, because that would reflect you would have less people working on the problem, fewer herbicides, less machinery.
Right.
So ultimately the insects would be saving us money in the long run.
In the long run.
Yeah. So I worked with the Tame Melaleuca project back early when it was started. We released Oxyaps videosa, which is a weevil. It looks like a tick with a snout. Then we released a psyllid, Boreoglycapsis was the name of the psyllid that we released. And I think the thing that was so neat about that insect, the thing that I liked about the insect, it was attracted to the color orange. So if I had to collect some for distribution to homeowners if they had Melaleuca problems. I would go out with a bucket similar to the bucket that I brought here. I would just turn it upside down on my arm, get out there on a nice sunny day with a lot of sunshine, and I would have an aspirator, and the psyllids, the Borrelia glycapsus, would fly out of my bucket, and I would just suck them into a vial, and I could give them out to people real easily. So you have to learn the insects to be able to work with them. And then we also had Lophlotoplosis, which was the gall-producing midge, which we were not involved in. I wasn't involved in that insect release, but every Melaleuca tree that I'm looking at now has these warty growths on it, and that's caused by that gall-producing midge. So, so all this is, they're all tools in our arsenal, and every time we introduce one of these biological control agents, that's one more thing that helps us get ahead of the game. So, so that's how I measure success. I like to think that they're established, staying here, and helping us get the job done. So, you know, we talked about Brazilian pepper earlier, but for those people that might not be familiar with Brazilian pepper, I actually brought some today. And people call it Florida holly, but this is Brazilian pepper. Can you see why people call it Florida holly? Yeah, it looks like a holly, and it actually has the berries on it right around Christmas time. So I've actually seen joggers collecting this, taking cuttings, and I think they were probably going home to make wreaths and things like that. But you and I both know that it's related to poison ivy. So even though I'm touching it now, I'll probably feel a little itchy later. So I think that jogger carrying those Brazilian pepper cuttings might have regretted that a little bit later, you know, because you do get a rash from this. So do you have anything you wanted to add? I know we talked about some of the biocontrol work. Is there anything you want to add about Brazilian pepper?
Brazilian pepper is probably the most widespread weed in Florida right now, and probably one of our biggest issues. Obviously in Florida we have a lot of invasive plants and a lot of invasive issues, but yeah, this one is probably the most widespread, and we are extremely excited about the potential of being able to release these agents, and we're hoping that they will have a significant impact.
So it's a pretty plant, which is why it was brought in. You know, it arrived here to be part of the ornamental trade back in the mid-1800s, and that was before they really had a handle on the whole idea of invasives. So they had no idea that this was going to take over, and now we see it pretty much anywhere that a bird might perch. And for those of us that have been around for a while, we know that when these beautiful red berries start to ripen up, and many of them are ripe, the robins come and other birds come, and they attack these pepper trees, eat the berries as they're fermenting, and it gets the robins a little bit drunk. So you basically have some drunk birds that also get a case of the runs as part of this. They fly up on the utility poles, on fence rows, anywhere that a bird would perch, and then the droppings would contain the seeds. So that's where you would find pepper trees growing, pretty much anywhere that a bird can perch, and which is a lot of places. A lot of these invasives, you don't find them in the middle of natural areas, except for like old world climbing fern and some others. This one you're finding along fence rows, highways, right-of-ways, and things like that. So I have some other plants. This particular weed, my flower petals fell off. This weed in this bucket is Wedelia, and this is another one of those plants that was a flower that was planted in landscapes. And like I tell people, once you have Wedelia, you always have Wedelia. And I don't think there's probably ever going to be any biocontrol work done on this. But it is one of those plants that landscapers do tend to struggle with in the landscape. Once you have it, it tends to take over. Also, you know, we talked about Melaleuca, and I actually found some Melaleuca, and it might not be possible for the camera to see it, but here are some of the galls that we talked about, that Lophlotoplosis was creating the galls on this. But this is the plant, this Melaleuca was taking over the Everglades, and it was actually planted on purpose. I've been told different stories, you know, they've dispersed the seeds by air and things like that. But each tree, when it comes under stress, like let's say for example, if it gets hit by lightning, or if a hurricane comes, Or let's say that you go to chop the tree down. That's when it's most likely to disperse its seeds. And each of these can have up to 100 million seeds per tree. I've also seen where it's fallen, where the trees fall in the woods, and each branch turns into a new tree. So literally it propagates itself that way as well. Not only by seeds, but also by vegetative cuttings and pieces of it. Also, in my little bucket of weeds here, I have this. I think it's Urania lobata. I believe is the genus and species of this.
It's Caesar weed.
Caesar weed. And this is the weed that when you go walking around outside and you get stickers on your clothing, this is the one you'll spend quite a bit of time picking the stickers off of your clothes. It's got a pretty little pink hibiscus-looking flower on it. The first time I ever worked with this weed, it is an invasive plant. I took a machete to it, not realizing how fibrous it was, and it had all the little seeds on it and little stickers. So I whacked it with the machete, and all the seeds recoiled back on me, and I spent probably about half an hour picking all of those seeds, all the little stickers off my clothes afterwards. So with this, you'd probably mow it down.
Probably mow it, but the seeds do stick to everything, and that's obviously how it spreads. This is actually one of the weeds that we are considering for biological control.
Oh, you'll have to keep me informed on that. That'd be exciting.
We will. It is getting more and more widespread. I go hiking often, and we see it in many places.
And unfortunately, for those people that have it, don't use a machete on it when it has all those little stickers. And then our last little weed here is Australian pine.
Probably not a little
weed. It's like the Christmas tree. But you tell the difference between this and regular pine trees. This is not native, by the way. It's Australian, I believe.
It is Australian.
It has little scales on the needles, so it looks significantly different from the pinus species that we have here in Florida. So these are just some of the invasive plants that we have in Florida and some of the very important work that you're doing here. And I do appreciate the time you spent with us today. I think it's important to help get the word out about the need for biological control and how important it is, the work that's going on right here in St. Lucie County. And is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up the show today?
I think we've just about covered it.
Good,
but
good.
biological control is a really good tool in the arsenal against invasive plants. It is the one tool in the arsenal that works when we don't have to. As soon as we get it established on the landscape, it's self-perpetuating, it's safe, and it works without us having to be out there.
Nice. Well, you and I are new colleagues. We've just met each other over the last month, and I look forward to having a nice, long career working together and collaborating.
Me as well.
So thank you very much for being with our show today. Here at the University of Florida IFAS in St. Lucie County, we have programs in research like with Dr. Minteer, teaching and extension. We are here in St. Lucie County providing support at everything from invasive weeds to tree crop and all the greening problems and all of that. If you have any questions, please feel free to call us at the Extension Office at 772-462-1660. Thank you.